All right, last ed puzzle lesson before the end of the unit. Going in before we go into the summative, last group of people we're going to look at is Japan, and this has a specific name. And once we get to it in the PowerPoint, I'm going to point it out. But if you just go Japan in the Middle Ages, we're going to be good. So again, we're going to be looking at Japan and how advanced was their civilization. And you're going to notice they're going to start a new religion. Some of the culture, science, and technology might be lacking, but at the same token, whenever you start a faith that's going to have followers still hundreds of years later, it's in the wheelhouse. So that's the point. Listen to the cultural advancements of the Japanese society. So in the beginning, we need to know where it's at. So Japan is clearly where it still is today. It's off the west coast, or excuse me, the east coast of China by Korea in such a way. And you're going to notice that with its location so close to Korea, a lot of the early influences are going to be influenced by them. But more about that when we get there. But you need to know a little bit more about it. The climate there is actually fairly mild, and they have a lot of rain. So with a lot of rain and milder climates, you would think it's prime for agriculture, but really it's not, because this is an island. Once upon a time, it was made by a volcano. So only 12% of its land can actually be used for farming. So if you ever wonder why the Japanese diet is so big on seafood, well, it only makes sense. They have a lot of access to water, so therefore that's what they're going to eat. So when it comes down to it, you're going to notice that also with it being an island, there's going to be a lot of bad weather that's also going to kind of not only work into their culture, but also the kind of the way of life. So here's where that new religion is going to come about, and it's called Shintoism. And a lot of people will confuse Shintoism with Buddhism, and it's pretty common because early on they're going to overlap quite a bit. But it's going to be around the first century CE. And for those that don't know what Shinto is, it's kind of like a spiritual thing, I guess you would say, where there's going to have it's kind of like how Native Americans worked, kind of like a polytheistic belief in such a thing that everything has a spirit, you got to respect it, and so on and so forth. And all the while, respect your ancestors. Okay, so this is going to sound really bad, but it's kind of like a Mulan, where they have that different room where they go and they pray. It's kind of similar to that. But they also believed in this thing called the divine spirit. So when we talked about this in World War II with kamikaze pilots and such, that's kind of where that's all coming from. But all the while, they operated in clans. So they really kind of just took care of their own, I guess you would say. They just basically operated within their own family. And there was no central government, and it wasn't that way for a while. So, true or false? Japan, they had a central government. True or false? So, here's where you're going to see it's going to start cranking up, and it's going to be right around the time of the fall of Rome. There's going to be a particular family, the Yamamotos. They're actually going to be so big and powerful during the time that they're going to emerge as the first emperors of Japan. And they were never overthrown. So, that's pretty dang impressive. All the while, they convinced people that they're actually descendant of the sun god. Okay, so right in line with absolute monarchy if you want to go that route. Okay, so they also kind of figured out they got to divide the power just a little bit, where they had a dual structure leadership. So if you remember, we talked about in World War II how they had an emperor, Hirohito, and then they also had another person in charge of the military, Hideki Tojo. That's kind of where this idea comes from. And it's going to be around until like the 40s and the 50s. So, and we're talking about something that started with the fall of Rome. So, again, the fact that this idea stayed in place for so long shows you the stability that they had. And again, kicking back to what I was talking about before, they're going to adapt cultures just like everybody else does during the time. There's going to be a new religion popping up out of India called Buddhism, where it's around self peace and inner peace. And it's going to get quite blended into Shintoism. And that's where this popular religion is still around to this day. So, why else does this matter? Is that the Koreans are going to notice, well, I already said the Koreans. The Chinese are going to give them a way of writing, which is a big deal, which we've already talked about. And then painting, which is also a big deal, which we kind of talked about when we talked about the inks and stuff. But then the everyday life of how they cooked and their habit of drinking tea and just how they get dressed is also going to come from the Chinese. So a lot of people will talk and get them confused. And that's kind of why their cultures all have the same background, I guess. So where this is going to start separating itself is in that name. So this is the specific name, the Heian period. And there's a crash course video about this I linked in. So if you want to watch it, you can. But we're talking about 400 years of history where Japan really kind of separates themselves. And this is where you're going to notice that discipline is going to be a huge proponent in their culture. We're talking about have the discipline not to laugh in public, and talking about the discipline of being more than just a working man or just being on the surface. You got to have some sort of culture behind you. And you've probably seen this painting right here. This is during the Heian period, the Great Wave. I see it on some of your guys' shirts and sweatshirts, and I laugh because you probably have no idea what it means. But this is talking about how to weather the storm, have this inner conflict. And you notice these boats, they don't sink, they're floating. So that's kind of the meaning behind it, I guess you would say. So, true or false, Japan had two leaders in their government. All right, so, and how is their society structured? Well, if you remember the European feudalism, or even if you remember the Chinese feudalism, history is going to repeat itself. Probably more than likely, the Chinese feudalism is going to make its way over to Japan, and Japan's going to operate the same way. So, under imperialism rule, where, again, king, I guess you would say, or basically the person that's calling the shots, the central government, they are going to be powerful landowners. They are going to need somebody to protect their land. And this is where the samurais come in. They're like the knights of Europe, if you will. But all the while, there's going to be different steps along the way that's going to basically revolve around land control and protection that's going to get to the same exact point. So the fact that three separate societies all have the same idea of structure in their civilization, there must have been something to this back in the day. But again, samurais during the time, they're still around in pop culture a little bit today, talking about the ninjas and stuff like that. So that's kind of a cool thing. And here's the structure. So this is what we talked about with the Europeans. Well, this is the Japanese feudalism. And if you look, there's a lot of correlation between the two. They just kind of change the names up from time to time. So, last question. Samurais in Japanese feudalism served the same purpose as blank in European feudalism.